Uh-oh. Okay, you're on notice, John, recording in progress.
Yeah,
Monday is my day off. This week it's mostly a day off, but I said I would have lunch with somebody who's coming from out of town, and they mentioned the date, but they didn't mention the day of the week, and I didn't check. And given the fact that they're coming quite a ways from out of town,
I think I was planning.
okay, that's fine.
I'll send you right up with something.
That's great. That would be super helpful. Then I can kind of begin to get my head around it, because I feel like if we have a game plan, we'll be fine, but I want to make sure we have a game plan. Okay,
I can't feel.
well, and we can talk about how we hope, yeah. Good morning, Marilyn. Yes, Nancy Pierce is joining us virtually this morning. Hello, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
All righty.
Was Jesus the only name
Yes,
in those days?
yes. Yeah, Yeshua, Joshua, it's all the kind of, they're all the kind of same derivation. I mean, it's kind of like, it's very interesting. The Spanish speaking people of New Mexico don't understand that my son's name is Ethiopian in origin. And so they believe that his name is Jared
Oh,
because it's Yared with a Y. But it's not, it really is Yared. It's Yared. That is the name of a saint in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, actually a saint of music. Much of the music that is still sung in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is attributed to Saint Yared. But I imagine that somewhere along the line, the name Jared, well, anything that's a Yah, that's like, even Jesus, Yeshua, Yahshua, is Yah is God. It's a form of the divine name.
Never really needed to
That
free PDF.
one thing the school system and a lot of Jesus and stuff. It's very confusing when you're reading the Bible and you read it out loud as Jesus and people look at you like, who? I have done that before and okay.
Claire and Richard spent plenty of time in Portuguese, with Portuguese and.
Sim, eu falo português muito bem. Você não entende nada. Você não entende nada.
You want to hear something funny? Is my son, I said something about Brazil, and he's like, they speak Spanish there. I said, no, they speak Portuguese. He's like, wait, Portuguese? I was like, yes, it was colonized by Portugal. He's like, really? That's a place? I'm like, oh my god. They teach geography.
Apparently, they don't know that.
There was at least 5 Brazilians in Milan that could go to.
Portuguese slower than Spanish.
Teach it, but they're not teach it.
Yeah.
Reading the National Geographic, where the Canary Islands, that volcano.
You were given blank maps of a certain.
They're saying
That's part of that.
it's like Yellowstone, that's
I
another.
didn't know that was part of that.
And then the assignment was, like, where the church
saying
was.
rations.
That's stuff.
You and me both, sister. Yeah, I was like.
That's like Hawaii. Hawaii shaded for
Yeah.
Central
I like
America.
this house, but I-
They're saying the mountain. I think it's gonna crash into the sea.
Big island. If it comes out of the ocean, it'll make an island bigger than Texas.
All right, Don, like you his spot.
Oh, that's a lot of,
Hot spot.
that's a lot of lava somewhere.
The dogs are under control, but they're tiling under my house this morning. And in other houses. So. It's a crazy moment.
We wait or more coming, or Joe chased people away.
I don't know if you saw the modification of some items. Today stuff.
Right, that was me. I kind of joked out. So I mean, I smashed all that. I didn't have to use another set. It was like 9:40.
Maybe you didn't open it.
But for those present, I had it on paper.
Oh, good.
He's giving me.
I'm not handing it out.
Oh, you're not handing.
Secret till it's the time.
I have to leave early. I hope I don't leave
Okay.
at the time.
It's a school teacher in me, because if I hand that ahead of time, you're all looking at it, it's like, don't look at that yet. Listen to it.
There were questions. Were there questions with this?
It's just an outline and a poem.
Okay.
Okay, so shall we begin up with a word of prayer?
Yeah.
Okay, so let us pray. Holy God, ever present, bless our time together as we seek to discern how your world works, and let us be open to mystery and trust and faith. And in this time of the year, give us hearts of thanksgiving that with all the evils in this world, we do not lose sight of the gifts, the precious gifts which you bestow upon us each moment of our lives. Amen. So I changed the program a little bit because I think we did enough, Joe. That whet your appetite. That's nice. Christmas Eve, you can sit around and read. But I don't know what Frank did. He and I really had a conversation. I don't know if we really talked about what this is. Okay, because that's a major theme. So I thought we just pull back and look at this word. It's a theological idea, and Joe deals with this. All the books of the Hebrew wisdom literature that you're looking at have to do with Theodicy. So I thought today we just pull back and say, what is this? And look at other texts of the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, I'm going to stick to that for now, that wrestle with this question and the different approaches to what we call theodicy. And then actually look at some modern theological answers to the question, and then into the poem. And then next week, because again, the original plan, I keep saying, was to do four sessions on 2 books of the Apocrypha, and just going to do 2 classes on that. But next week will be an introduction to what is the Apocrypha. Some of you may know, some of you may not know. I talked to some folks, and there was the idea that not everybody may have an idea of what that is. So what are these apocryphal books which are not in our Protestant Bibles? And they're from this intertestamental period. The reason they're not in our Bibles is because they were originally written in Greek and not in Hebrew. But they're really transitional to see the wisdom tradition as it carries through in the couple centuries before Christ. And then the last 2 sessions in December, we'll look at the letter of James in the New Testament, which is really carrying on that tradition. And he, throughout James quotes from these, what we would call apocryphal books. That's part of his wisdom tradition. So I think that's a nice connection. I was gonna say, I mean, this is so Hebrew Bible. It's hard not to say, but what do we as Christians do with this? Doesn't mean you dismiss it, but that's a whole other class. You know, looking at what we're going to call theology through the lens of Christ. You can't dismiss it. We're not supersessionists. It's like, oh, we don't care about what happens in the Hebrew Bible. But particularly Karl Barth, wrestling with this question, which we'll go over in a minute, he said, you know, we can look at all this, but we have to be Christocentric about it. And what does Jesus Christ have to tell us about the meaning of suffering? But that's another. So theodicy. So word of theo, just theo, you know, means God, and dk is justice. So it's God's justice. This is a word that was coined by Leibniz, the philosopher, in 1710. And it's basically trying to discuss the problem of evil. whenever you're wrestling theologically with the problem of evil in the world, that's theodicy. God's justice. And often you make a distinction between two types of evil. I know what they are. There's natural evil. It could be sickness, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, famine, things like that. And then moral evil, which is what we do. So there's all different theodicies. If there's a good God, why there's a flood that, killed tens of thousands of people, why did God let that happen? Or it could be cancer, why did someone get cancer? And then there's evil like the Holocaust. Why does God allow genocide to take place? Why does God intervene? So there's all those different. So when you look at theodicy, some of it is discussing that problem of evil. Some theodicy tries to defend God. Yeah, there's evil, but this is why God does it. And some are really just more what you call rational theology. You're trying to make Christian theology very logical and rational. So evil sometimes seems to throw things out of whack. So it's a way to try to make all the pieces fit together. But most Christian Jewish theodicy really has to do with the question of evil. If God is, to use all the omni words, God is omniscient, all-knowing, if God's omnipotent, all-powerful, and if God is omnibenevolent, all the omnis, the three omnis, he's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, then why does God allow evil to flourish in the world? It doesn't seem to fit. This often hits with the idea of providence, with a capital P, not capital Rhode Island, but because this doesn't look very well used, I better break the binding. That's an old college trick. I didn't read the book. Now it looks like I did. Well, it's online. I use the online version. But in the Heidelberg Confession, which is, I think, kind of the most warm-hearted of the confessions, it's describing providence. So this is our confessional way of saying this. How do you understand the providence of God? The almighty and ever-present power of God, by which God upholds as with his hand heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them that leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty, all things, in fact, come to us not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. It's the idea that God's just providing, God's taking care of everything. So if you have this very providential view of the Creator, then there's evil. Why is God withdrawing God's fatherly, loving, tender hand in this particular circumstance? This is largely a Jewish, Christian, Muslim problem.
So is evil the absence of God? Is that what you're saying?
That's one theological view. It's actually a view of the early church fathers, which was just a negation of God. But whenever you're trying to explain why does a good God allow evil, wherever you deal with it, that's theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? I think Job is a theodicy, Proverbs is theodicy, Ecclesiastes is theodicy. In Proverbs, live a good life, you'll be blessed. Ecclesiastes, it's a mystery, you'll never figure it out. Job, it's a struggle, it's a mystery. God is there, we might never figure it out. But I would say it's really a problem for the Abrahamic religions. Do you have an idea why? Really, the Asian religious philosophies don't wrestle with this.
We have much in the way of deity, it seems to me.
Well,
It's a Hindu. Yeah.
I know you get called, they're all things. Right. But it's really a monotheistic problem. If you believe there's just one God, if you're polytheist, like most of the ancient religions, it's not a problem. Because things happen, was that bad God did that, or that God is, angry with this God, and look at the Greek myths, people are always stuck in the middle of gods who are getting vengeance on each other. So if you look at the Norse and Greek and Roman and Babylonian gods, it's just And those gods are not always, they're not good. Some of them are kind of rotten. You know, so if you're polytheistic, you don't have this problem. You get the Asian philosophies, it's more to the, you know, in Hinduism, there's just the ultimate reality, and everything we experience as evil is part of that one reality, the ultimate, the Brahma. So, you know, in Hinduism, there's millions and millions of gods, but they're all faces of the one ultimate reality. And some of the gods are benevolent, then you have like Kali who's there, you know, with chopping off heads, but all that negative stuff is part of reality too. But again, these religions have this idea of karma, that there's this karmic balance, that over eons, everything's going to work itself out. So what if things are out of balance now, that's okay. You've got millions of years for everything to get back into balance again. So when you have one God who's one good God, and you've really got just one lifetime, this is where the, you know, if you're reading, yeah, I was a bad person, so I'll come back, you know, as a mongoose or something next lifetime. You know, we don't have that option. So the Jewish, Christian, Muslim is like, you've got this one lifetime and there's a good God, so how do we deal with the reality of evil? So there's really not a theodicy problem. But then you do get verses which are closer to that. I'm just going to read it. And Prophet Isaiah. Is that Isaiah 45:7? I am the Lord God, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. So there's a verse in the prophet Isaiah that says what we experience as evil still comes from God. Despite what we read in Job, remember, Satan is not the devil. It's one of the heavenly court. There is no, in the Hebrew Bible, there's no devil, there's no Satan. There's nothing that is not God. There's no opponent to God. If there's the accuser, that's just in this story to, you know, challenge this way of thinking. But there is no, the idea that there's some evil force out there, which is an enemy of God, is not part of the Hebrew tradition. And many people will just look at the devil and Satan as a way to get God off the hook. It's a very simplistic theology. God's good, so if bad things happen, the devil may be good.
Where we heard that.
Right. But there isn't. So it's just like, well, there's bad and good, but so this kind of dualistic, that happens later. You're going to start to see that in the intertestamental period, and you'll start to see evidence of that in the New Testament. That dualism, that good versus evil, that really comes from Greek thought and works its way into Jewish and Christian theology. But if you're looking at pre-exilic Hebrew theology, everything's from God. You can't have anything that's not part of God. So, but that's where theodicy becomes an issue. So you can't say it's the evil demons out there doing it. There's all Jewish saying that God created us with the good inclination and the evil inclination. The Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Tov. So we were created to have complete free will. So God gave us the evil inclination. It's like the angel and the devil on the shoulder. But God gave, this is the Jewish thought, but God gave you the remedy for the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is the Torah. So when you're tempted to do this, no, I don't do that. So God gave you the corrective. But it's not like there's actually a real devil out there, it's within ourselves.
So I look at this as chaos. Evil is chaos, and God is trying to control chaos. God's trying to control chaos. And that's why I look at evil being chaotic. And
It's disorder.
you know,
Okay, well, some people are defining what evil is the absence of good. This is a thing in itself, it's to have substance, or it's just negation.
I think there's a limitation though to that discussion that, you know, you have this ability and we're good and evil, and that the Torah directs you to doing what's correct. Because if we think about modern life, we know that there are so many people that are unchurched, and don't have the Torah, don't have the Bible as a reference, but they're really good people. So I think that leaves out a lot of people when you say that you have the Torah, I mean, because so
Sure. Well, I mean,
a small
I
percentage.
doubt that in traditional Hebrew and Jewish thought, there's no evil force out there.
Yeah.
That it is just an act of our will for, not moral evil, natural evils and another debate. But we can't plead ignorance. Gee, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to steal. Gee, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to covet, to commit adultery. It's in there, so you can't plead ignorance.
So, Jewish before did not have Satan. I mean, the original Jewish faith, there was no Satan.
The theology of the Hebrew Bible is not dualistic. There's no good and evil. Okay?
Going more towards Christian.
Yeah, and then it's complex, and even when the devil shows up in the New Testament, it's not necessarily there's somebody with horns and a pitchfork. I mean, that's more daunting. You know, it's just. But the idea is there's one God, there's one creator, there's nothing that's outside of God. So I just read from Isaiah, what we experience as good and evil is still from the hand of God. There can't be anything outside of God. There's no enemy. So Satan, as Joe Hasatan, is just one of the heavenly court who, you know, is in that, for that story, is kind of like the royal advisor who's out checking around to see how things are going on earth, to accuse people who are not being faithful.
This may be more historical than anything else, but how do the Askenazians fit into that? Or the Askenazians and
Zoroastrian.
Zoroastrian.
I'm not going to say.
I
But
would
some
not
people that there know that, well, that's coming on because that's very dualistic.
okay.
And so whatever something.
And it was earlier, wasn't it? It was sort of.
But you do have the good God of Zoroaster, but then you do have like the evil one. So you get this dualism. But even the separation of body and soul, that's Greek. The Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, there's no idea till you get to the really late books that there's a separate soul from the body. There's no idea that the body dies and the soul lives on. You're done, you're done. That's why there's such an emphasis on having children. That's your eternal life. But you have to look, I mean, these are people, these are Jews living in this Hellenistic world. And so when these Greek ideas start to come in, dualistic idea of body and soul, good and evil start to enter into the, I mean, who knows what the ultimate truth is, but the answer in the Hebrew Bible is not there. So that's why it's a problem for theodicy. You can't blame it on, it's not God's fault, it's that bad God over there. Well,
They wanted to vindicate God in the court of law.
right, no, that's one of the approaches. So I can't say, but so how do you, I mean, just to throw it out there, how do you answer that question? Why does it, if God is just, God is all knowing and all powerful and all good, why does God allow, let's stick with moral evil, why does God allow evil to flourish?
Gave man a mind of his own.
Hmm?
Because he gave man a mind of his own.
So it's the consequence of just having free will.
Another difference that might bear on it is, unlike some of the pagan religions or even some of the other monotheistic religions, you have to believe, or I should say you have to, the Abrahamic religions believe that God cares. Whereas others, even if you only worship one God, you placate that God, or you make that God feel good, and then that God does good things for you, but that God doesn't care. And the Abrahamic religions say, no, God cares.
It's a personal God. The Asian God, it's more personal.
And that's why it's a problem that God allows evil or misfortune.
Yeah, because the Asian philosophy is if you bad karma, you did it to yourself. No, you're not being judged.
A God that's good could allow misfortune, but a God that cares.
So but a God that cares could permit misfortune.
Well, that's I'm not saying that God could or couldn't, I'm saying that that's why it's a problem that God could.
Or why, why would God?
So free will. I mean, I got a whole list here of like 9 different types. So I'm just saying, see if you can come up with some first. Why would a good God allow evil to flourish?
So Matthew doesn't like my opinion, my dualism. A good and bad God, Old Testament God versus a New Testament God.
No, it's
Like that.
same with us.
But I can reconcile
Okay.
better.
Is it to humiliate or make you humble? And
Let's look at some of the. Teacher now.
Oh, got one there.
We're not going to read through all this, and this is just from an article. I cited my sources, so I'm not completely plagiarizing, but I did edit it, put in some more Bible verses and reformat it.
I'll send out a copy of this, probably tonight.
Okay, for the folks online. So, yeah, Theodicy, there it is. In a world created by God, where does evil originate? So, see, we're more than halfway down. So questions of theodicy abound in the Hebrew Bible. Here's what we're going to look at. It's just, we don't need to look up every single verse, because the Bible, the Old Testament Hebrew Bible does not have one voice on this. You saw that debate in Job. There's all different views on this. Okay. So there's. So the first is the most common, known as the retributive view. You've been getting all these theological terms. The retribution. This is the basic idea that suffering is punishment for sin. This is what you heard Job's friends pushing on Job. You must have done something. You look good, but you must have some secret sins, or this wouldn't be happening to you. So whenever you hear that hurricane hit New York or New Orleans because they're so sinful there, or that comes out, the natural evil, we're being punished for this particular sin. That's the retributive view, and it pervades the Hebrew Bible.
Don't you also, because of your father? I mean, is it happened again? Is that?
It's coming up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
That's the intergeneration. But this is common view. People suffer, there's evil, it's a punishment. You must have done
What
something.
about the people that aren't bad in that city that gets the hurricane? I mean, are they being punished because their next door neighbor was evil?
Collateral.
This is pervasive. And you really see this because of the most basic biblical history was after the fall of Judah and the Babylonian exile. Are you familiar with this? Yes, no?
Yeah.
Okay. So remember, there was the kingdom of Israel, and then it split into 2 kingdoms, and the kingdom of Israel was conquered by the empire of Assyria. So the northern tribes all disappeared into history of ancient Israel. Then you had the little kingdom of Judah. So about 720 to 587, that was all that was left, was the little kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital. And the Babylonians came in about 590 BC and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple of God, just murdered the royal family and took the leaders of the Jews into exile in Babylon for 50 years.
Yeah, Syria.
So this was the crisis, because before the exile, that's the end. I mean, because the idea was, if you ask an ancient Israelite, who are we? We live in this land that was promised to our ancestor Abraham, And he said we would be here forever. And we worship the God who's in that temple, the one God, and that's God's house on earth. That's where heaven and earth touch. And we're reigned over by a descendant of King David. And God promised that the family of David would reign forever. Okay, all gone. Temple destroyed, not 1 square inch is. So he's saying, why did this happen? What happened to the covenant? What happened to the promise? So the Jews had to wrestle with, why did this happen to us? What was our great sin that God is punishing us this way? So the Bible, as we know, was largely put together, the Hebrew Bible, during the Babylonian exile. Because it's like, we've lost everything, all we have left are our stories and our traditions. So they wrote, the pen is mightier than the sword. We're going to write down our stories. They can take our land, they can destroy our temple, but as long as we have our book, we know who we are. So even after the Persians conquer the Babylonians, the Jews can go back to Jerusalem if they want to, the religion's never the same. It becomes a book-based religion. The temple doesn't matter as much. But they still had to wrestle with, why did this happen? So the idea is there must have been, what was the sin that God was punishing us for? So when the exiles were writing the history, most of the stories that we have in the Hebrew Bible were put in the form we have them today during the exile. So it was really written for the exile audience to try to explain, how did we end up in this situation and how are we going to maintain our hope? So even when they're writing the stories of Abraham and Moses and David, they're writing to try to make sense of history. And a lot of it is retributive. We were idolatrous. We didn't worship the one God. We committed these sins. One of the most horrific is, if you read Ezra and Nehemiah, they were blaming foreign wives, that they had married foreign women. And that's why God punished them. They were mixing the blood. And then you get books like Ruth, which say that's nonsense. But so that's the retributive view. And it knows that Deuteronomistic history, the author of the book of Deuteronomy, is really writing the story in that way to say that God is punishing us because we were not faithful to covenant. So we need to renew, be faithful again. Now, is this view still out there today? Nobody says, well, something bad happened to you because God's punishing you. Maybe only for natural disasters.
I think it's a factor of your age as to what you were taught growing up. And, you know, that was a lot of early church school was, you need to be good or else. And, you know, the word hell was mentioned. And we don't use that language anymore. And
remember, the ancient Israelites didn't really believe in a hell as modern Christians do. There was a place of Sheol, of non-existence. So this later gets translated, if you're bad, you'll go to hell. But for the Israelites, you're going to get punished in this life because there isn't any life to get punished in. So it's this world.
but you know, theories on learning say that punishment only works while there's somebody there to do the punishing. And so it doesn't really change behavior long term. And so it may work in the moment, but not over time. It's not still.
So I have this vision, talking about your youth, their child. You mentioned this, the devil and the angel, one's on one shoulder. I still have a signature. And it was just girl, then you have to. Yeah.
They get to take turns.
Yeah. Well, they're talking to me. Yeah.
You've seen too many movies.
I was 5 years old.
Well, I think a lot of, this punishment idea. Well, you got parental,
That's the next
Parental
one. We can move on to that one.
and that idea kind of, that's how we all grew up, this is bad, this is good, and you do, and I think it does last the rest of your life. All that stuff that happened when you're 6 years old, it's with me right now. So, there's something there.
So most common
Well, there
activities.
are consequences, to some actions, are punishment enough.
Well, and some of this is, not necessarily consequential, I mean, maybe it's an example or something, we need some bad stuff to compare the good stuff to. I mean, you learn that over time, that
And
if
certain,
everything is even keeled, then.
certain laws and ethics, you can't, break without the consequences.
Right.
This is the oldest, and again, as it says, this comes from jurisprudence. I mean, you commit a crime and get punished. Or military, you're on sideways. So, but you see it in Psalms, you see it in Proverbs, you certainly saw it in Job in the voice of his friends. This wouldn't be happening to you if you didn't deserve it. And then you get the educative, that's the next one. God's the loving parent. So as it says in Proverbs, my child, do not despise the Lord's discipline, for the Lord reproves the one whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. So punishing you because I love you, to make you a better person. Then they get the idea of suffering as a test. Testing the probative. Probably the most, you see that with Job. Is he being faithful because he's getting something out of it? Or just because he truly is truly righteous? And by the most famous is when Abraham was called to sacrifice his only son, whom he loves, Isaac, as a test. Now I see that you are faithful to me because you're willing to, whether Abraham would have went through it or not, that's another discussion, but was willing to sacrifice his son. You passed the test. Faith. Okay. May those ring true. And you have some other, if you look on the back, the eschatological view. This is the idea there's evil, but everything's going to be straightened out at the end of time. So it's kind of a outside of history. And you, at the end of time, the evil will be punished. And so the good people who seem to be suffering now at the end of time, they'll be blessed. Certainly hear this in the New Testament. So it's like, don't look for justice now, but it'll happen one day at the end of time. And then you have what's called revelational, the idea that suffering somehow draws you closer to God. And I think that's worth looking at if you want. If your Bibles, look at Psalm 73. Not the whole psalm, but go to verse 21. 73:21. So, read there. When my soul was
Slightly different
sure.
version. When my soul was embittered, when I was pricked in heart, I was stupid and ignorant. I was like a beast toward thee. Nevertheless, I am continually with thee. Thou dost hold my right hand. Thou dost guide me with thy counsel, and afterward thou wilt receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is nothing upon earth that I desire besides thee. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. For lo, those who are far from thee shall perish, though thou dost put an end to those who are false to thee. But for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the Lord God my refuge, that I may tell of all thy works.
Thank you. Yeah, so just hearing, even when all these bad things are happening, it's but I know that you're with me, you companion me through this. So somehow going through this suffering somehow brings you closer to God. Instead of making you wrestle with it, it's kind of an assurance. Thank you. And then you have the idea that all our knowledge of God is partial. Who really understands? It's what's a mystery. So that's the mysterious. God's hidden. And you see that in Isaiah. Certainly you saw it in Ecclesiastes, Job 28, you know, who's ever going to know the mind of God? So you just kind of accept the mystery of it all. Then you get the determinist, God's everything, you know, it's suffering, but it's all part of God's plan. So just deal with it. This is the real predestinarian view. That everything's ultimately working out to God's purposes because God has micromanaged everything since before the moment of creation. So yeah, it's evil, but it's ultimately going to work out for God's plan.
And that's sort of the opposite, that's sort of fatalist.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I have my own thoughts and views about how it should go.
Some of these are going to overlap, like a bit like
Calvin.
right. But he's, you know, he buffers it. He also goes the mystery route. I still remember that passage when I was having to study Calvin in seminary. It's like even if he gives the example of a thief who, you know, hits somebody over the head in the woods, you know, it's robbed, that's somehow part of God's plan. You know, every crime that takes place. So this is the determinist view. Then you get the substitutionary. This is really, you start to see this certainly more in Christian theology, and what's quoted there, all the suffering servant songs in Isaiah. That there's suffering, someone's suffering so that others may overcome suffering. The scapegoat. You know, by your stripes, I only know the old translation from the Messiah. By your stripes we are healed. By your suffering we are saved. So this really gets worse. Through Christ's suffering we overcome death. You may be surprised at Genesis 18:19. That's when Abraham is bargaining with God about Sodom. Because when Abraham finds out that God plans to destroy the wicked city of Sodom, and Abraham said, wait a minute, that's not fair. What if there's 50 righteous people? And God says, okay, if there's 50 righteous people, I won't destroy Sodom. But what if there's 45 righteous people? Okay, if there's 4, what if there's 4? And so he keeps bargaining God down, I think, to 10. It's like, okay, if there's 10 righteous people, I won't destroy it. But the idea, if there were at least 10 good people, you know, I would save it. So.
Who's the judge?
Huh?
Who's the judge whether they're good?
Here you go. Here's transgenerational. Again, there's no belief in the afterlife, that this is where the children will pay for the sins of the parents. So maybe it looks like the parents are getting off because they're prospering, but if they're wicked, their future generations are going to pay the price. That's very early. That kind of fades away. Certainly Jesus speaks out against that. And when Jesus speaks out against that, that's already part of the Jewish tradition to say, that's really not how God operates. But again, if you don't believe in an afterlife punishment, this is a way to make sense of things. How come that rich guy, he's only getting rich by hurting people, prospering? Don't worry about it. His children will pay the price. It's a way to try to explain why things are the way they are.
The Greek bring that in, or that was already starting?
Oh,
I mean, was that the Greek that said?
That was already, my understanding is already Jewish tradition, people are looking at that. But you find it, so all these in here, and then there's denial. I mean, the fool says in his heart there is no God. You could just say there is no God and there is no God of justice, so just forget about it. And many ancient Israelites, people, they were tempted into polytheism, because polytheism was it was easier to deal with evil when you had a lot of gods instead of just one. So that's just getting it. I mean, that's not a biblical view, that's more historical. So all those, you can go through it from retributive to transgenerational. These are all different ways in the Hebrew Bible that people try to say, explain why do bad things happen to good people.
There's an element of truth in every one of them. I mean, it's they're all right, and yet they don't follow all the way through. Some of them look really kind of strange.
Isn't that part of having different religions now though, too. That they believe differently on how to answer that question.
Yeah, I guess that comes under the recent theodicies.
If you want to get it. So. I guess the point of the way this class was originally is. Come back to Frank, was to look at Hebrew wisdom literature. I think if you look at it's throughout there, it's in the prophets, it's in the Genesis, it's in Exodus, it's throughout the Bible. This is a question that people wrestle with. And it really rises to the surface again from Babylonian exile, where it looks like what happened to the covenant, there must be a reason for this. So even when the older stories are retold, they're trying to answer that question, but why are bad things happening to us? And I'll just say, even, for Jews today, when you have persecutions and genocides, to come back to these stories again to try to make sense. That's why, the word back to the story of Abraham and Isaac. I mentioned this. When Abraham is called to sacrifice his son Isaac as a whole burnt offering, the Greek word for whole burnt offering is holocaust. Make your son a holocaust to me. So when the Jews were saying, what do we call this experience that we just had? It's a test. It was a test of our faith. The knife was at our throats. There's a prayer in the Jewish prayer book, how can we praise you after Auschwitz? How can we glorify your name after Treblinka? So the idea is, but you keep at it. Faith is hard. I mean, we've suffered this evil, but Abraham got through it, we'll get through it too. So some of these are clearly, it's a whole other class to say, how do we as Christians look at these different theories? Theologically, we're very much in the eschatological substitutionary act. That, Christ died for us, he suffered for us. And at the end of time, everything will be rectified. But that doesn't necessarily give a satisfactory answer when we're dealing with things in our everyday lives. For many people. Just some of these recent theodicies at the bottom, turns to there's something called protest theodicy. And protest theodicy, so a lot of these are controversial. These are like 20th century theologies. They're going to take an issue with the omnibenevolent. Maybe God isn't completely 100% good. And you have to struggle with it. The Genesis 32 is Jacob wrestling with God to the point where his hips dislocated and he limps off. But the idea that you wrestle with God. I put the Elie Wiesel there because I think you're familiar with him, the Holocaust survivor. And in the book Night, there's a famous scene where a young innocent boy is hanged. And then the prisoners are forced to watch the execution. Familiar with this scene. And somebody in the back says, where is God for us now? And somebody said, there he is, pointing at the dead body, the body of the dead boy hanging in the gallows. The idea that somehow the God that we had trust in is gone. Now, Theodicy, he maintained his faith as a young boy. If you read the story, he worked in the synagogue. But going through that experience, it's like God feels absent to us. My God, why have you abandoned me? There's so many Psalms that are saying, God, why are you making this happen? So that's kind of the protest theodicy, is that not that God's omnibenevolent, but you can challenge God's goodness. It doesn't seem like you're very good right now. And a faithful response is to engage in that struggle.
We brought Elie Wiesel to UNM about
Fantastic.
10 or 15 years ago to work with our students, and he did a presentation at Popejoy. And I'll never forget, somebody asked him at the end, aren't you angry at God for, everything that you went through? And he looked at her, I'll never forget this, and he said, you know what? When I die, God and I are going to have a little talk.
That's a protest theodicy.
That's exactly.
Doesn't seem fair, but thank you. That's it. That's protest theodicy. Just don't say, oh, well, God's good. I guess it's my fault. No, say, what are you doing here? It's a response. Then there's process theology. Does anybody know process theology? This became great. This is John Cobb and Harvey Shuhaki and Hartshorn. And they take issue with the omnipotent issue. They believe that there's a good, loving God, but the creation is not perfect. But it's what you call that God is not above creation. God is beyond creation, but also within creation, and that God changes. God is not eternal and unchanging. This is a whole new way of thinking about God. The creation affects God just like God affects creation, and almost like God can learn. So you can look at the Hebrew Bible and say, man, that was kind of rough. The way that all those Egyptians got treated, Pharaoh was bad, but all those people deserve it, and maybe moving into becoming a more loving God and say, or that when he changes his mind, not to destroy, in the book of Jonah, we won't destroy him, that I changed my mind because you repented. So we ever look at these stories where God changes God's mind. This is more process theology. And it's the idea that the power of process theodicy is that many people really resist this because it's not very biblical. It's coming from other ideas, but that God is suffering with us. God's with us in our suffering. It's like when our hearts are broken, God's hearts are broken with us. So his love in creation, but God doesn't have the full power to fix everything, but is kind of learning as part of creation with us. God's not separate from creation with us. So that story in Elie Wiesel, we talk about that probably, I don't know, you may have heard him talk about that for many people there, yeah, for them, the God that they had trusted was dead. But a Christian might look at that and say, here's God suffering with us. It's not that God doesn't care, it's actually God's presence.
I had a rabbi tell me one time during the Exodus that when the water came in and killed all the Egyptians, those were his people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's-
Right.
And then there's John Hicks' famous soul-making theodicy, and this is the idea that it kind of goes against original sin, that we're actually, this isn't completely educated, but that suffering is a way that we grow morally and spiritually, and God wants us to we're perfecting ourselves. And this goes back to an ancient church father named Irenaeus, they call it Irenaean theodicy, that the imperfections of the world are a way that we grow and strengthen in our faith and in our character. Without suffering, we would never grow. So again, justify the horrible suffering that people go through, but there is a reason why God creates the world as it is, that we can grow as souls. And in liberation theology, this is often African American, is that we're to participate in the fight against suffering. The way that we deal with suffering in the world is to join with God to fight injustice and suffering. So, I mean, none of these really are kind of answering the question, but there are different ways to respond to it. Instead of saying, oh, well, stuff happens. Must be some kind of purpose. So that's a lot. I mean, is theodicy even worth it? Some people say theodicy is just like, it's angels on the head of a pin. It's just doesn't have much practical application, although I would argue some of these recent theodicies are practical. But
So is soul making in the sense when you're aware of a bad situation and you try to correct it and make something better? I mean, it's really sort of almost the basis of so much philanthropy that goes on, trying to build spaces for homeless people or to.
if we live in a perfect world, we just never grow up. So this isn't educative like God is purposely doing something to make me better. It's like life is, we learn through life.
Well, it's becoming aware and deciding to pursue something good rather than choose to be bitter or separate yourself from it.
So I'm Catholic, so the Bible is, I didn't grow up with it. So how do you answer people? I mean, do you just say these are all the different ways you go about it?
Well, in a pastoral situation,
Yeah.
right here you've got an eschatological, of course. It's quite retributive.
how about saying?
No, I mean, this is real theology. I mean, this was me taking that detour. I mean, the original class was what the Hebrew wisdom literature say about suffering and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And I just wanted to take a class to say that this is a question at the heart of all faith. And it's there from Genesis chapter 1 to the book of Revelation, trying to make sense of sometimes our faith and our experience of the world doesn't, our understanding of who God is and our experience of the world don't match. So how do we try to make sense of it? I mean, you're asking me which one is it?
What do you teach when your students ask you some of these questions? I mean, there's just a variety of ways to look at it.
Well, okay. I've said when we hear this, I mean, intentionally, because that's what I was told by Matthew and Frank, this is more of an academic situation in this class, less devotional. I don't know what you're used to. So I'm just introducing different biblical views. But I think if I were in a pastoral situation, I would listen to people and say which one is working for them. It depends on whether you're Matthew and this is your congregation or like your hospital chaplain, like I used to be. No, because frankly, when people are going through things in the hospital, their way of getting through it would be one of these theories, which I would find not good. But we say that's Band-Aid ministry. It's like, well, I guess God let my baby die to teach me a lesson. Okay. Or God let my baby die to punish me because I had an abortion 5 years ago. They would say things like that. And it's not the pastor's job to say it or the chaplain to say it. How can you think that way? That's how they're coping. But I think a pastor would, over time, just talk with people. How do we make sense of this? I frankly, none of these theodicies are satisfactory. It's just I would think of someone who's a pastor saying I had something bad happen because I deserved it. To me, that would be a counseling issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or just listening. I'm probably answering the question because I'm a teacher, not a pastor so much now. It's just, it's a kaleidoscope. And the point is, if you care, I'm personally, the view is when you wrestle with this stuff, I think it's an act of worship because God's saying you care enough to engage. That's why Job was congratulated by God. All these people who said gave the easy answers, they're wrong. You said this doesn't make sense, and you're right. So I think I kind of like sometimes have to be in the end of embracing the mystery. And
I really gave myself a lot of credit for how he lived his life when he got out of there, because one of the other things he said to us, one of the students said, I don't remember where he went. He went to someplace in Eastern Europe that was getting hammered. And they said, why did you go there? And he said, because nobody came for us. And that's how he lived his life.
But I mean, they can do it to me. That's why I don't know, Theodicy, that's what they take. I said, we will take this to make sure other people, because a witness doesn't happen to other people. So I didn't give a very clear answer on that. I guess I'm being, because I mean, it's rare that a student comes to me and asks me a question of theodicy. Like, why'd you take a point off my participation grade? Which you do. Keep calling it. No, really, that's about great, but about ultimate things. But when students have come to me, I mean, I usually just listen, and that's all. I think that's what you need. Sometimes.
Do you put questions like this in your exams?
I generally, the upper level students learn this word, but I don't.
Okay,
You have this. Before,
just to see what the response.
I don't, this is kind of beyond most of where I'm. Well, you asked my view, I would say this is one of my favorite poems. And I don't know which of these categories it fits into. But it's a Scottish poet, Edwin Muir, and he's taking images from Eden and also from the parable of the weeds in Matthew. You know, the weeds and the grain, they look good when they're young, but don't pull it, because you'll know what the weeds are when they're fully grown. If you start pulling out stuff, it's a judgment parable. You start weeding stuff out, you might accidentally weed out the good with the evil. But when everything's grown, it'll be pretty obvious. So it is kind of an eschatological view. Don't worry about taking care of evil at the end of time, and everything will separate itself out. So if you indulge me, I think this is a nice theodicy in here. 1 foot in Eden, still I stand and look across the other land. The world's great day is growing late, yet strange these fields that we have planted so long with crops of love and hate. Time's handiwork by time are haunted, and nothing can now separate the corn and tares. Tares is the weeds, the corn and weeds compactly grown. The armorial weed and stillness bound about the stalk, these are our own. Evil and good stand thick around in the fields of charity and sin, where we shall lead our harvest in. So a world where evil and good are so intertwined, you just can't manage to separate them. Yet, still from Eden springs the root, as clean as on the starting day. Time takes the foliage and the fruit and burns the archetypal leaf to shapes of terror and of grief scattered along the winter way. But famished field and blackened tree bear flowers in Eden never known. Blossoms of grief and charity bloom in these darkened fields alone. What had Eden ever to say of hope and faith and pity and love, until was buried all its day and memory found its treasure trove? Strange blessings never in paradise fall from these beclouded skies. I'd say this is kind of a whatever category you want to put that in. But the idea, this is kind of closer to the soul making. That it's in this world that looks so full of evil, that has wonderful blessings never needed. It's because of the suffering that you go through that we have faith, we can show pity, we have charity, to true love. I do that with my students. Do you think the first man and woman, they really love each other before they eat the fruit? Did they really have a relationship? I mean, he didn't even name her until after they ate the fruit.
So what did Jesus say? So what did Jesus say
About
God? Yeah.
this next semester.
Frank will deal with that.
As I said, I realize I'm doing it because, there's a whole Christological theodicy here.
This
But
whole exercise seems to be, the whole, what we're doing here, what we do down in the sanctuary, all of our lives, we're just trying to make ourselves work better, basically, how to get along better, how to make your life work better, and it comes down to morality. And if you follow the right way, whatever that is, and we try to figure out what that is all of our life, and church. When I was a kid, everybody did it. It's going away, but what's going to replace that moral compass of society these days? I don't know, but we need something or another, and these are a lot of ways to look at a lot of things, but and like I said, none of them are perfect, but they all have a grain of what's the way to do things, so.
Yeah, I think it's true that we define an organized religion, understand it, other social And I think that's the danger. We get social media, people are just getting affinity groups. Which are pseudo-religious. And I think, at least in our tradition, we're willing to say there are all different ways to think about this. Let's struggle, but people want easy answers. And they're easy to get an easy answer from somewhere. That can be dangerous.
I think as we get older, sometimes they kind of change our, which one it is and how we look at it. Stuff. Life experience is kind of.
Sure, that gets into social, it's like a Fowler stage of religious development. You know, the 5-year-old, 15-year-old, the 25-year-old, the 45, and 85-year-old, who's kind of conceptions of things. You know, so the retributive makes much more sense when you're younger, except as we get older. So thanks for indulging with that poem. That's one of my. Everyone said we want to go back to Eden. It's like, no, actually. That is something I do with my students. It's like that. If we were not fallen, we would not be human. And they have a response to that. This idea that perfect humanity was hard, but they were just kind of like children. They didn't know it's all those things, all those curses that God gives us, just describing the reality of life. Yeah, you're gonna have to work. Yeah, you're gonna have pain. But guess what? That makes you more like God. Well, thank you. Next week will be the Apocrypha. But so as I go, John, we get to the actually looking at Sirach and Ecclesiasticus, whatever, I'll make copies of the chapters we're going to look at. So if your Bible doesn't have the Apocrypha, don't worry about it. Yeah, so I mean, we'll just look at some highlighted chapters. Thank you.
I've seen different articles about how and we're instrumental in developing our understanding of capitalism. And I kind of just